Okay, well, welcome everybody to the first board meeting of 2025. Let's start with minutes. And John, do you have information on the status of the last minutes?
Yeah, those minutes were distributed last Friday. Bianca, you had offered a comment on the minutes. I'm not sure if you were proposing that an edit be made to the minute.
Yeah, I would make an edit.
Do you want to offer that edit?
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. Let me read it. Hold on. I just have to find it. I don't want to hold up the show here. I sent John an email. I don't know how if the meeting minutes need to be. Oh, here it goes. I said I would like to clarify my comments about the rate base in the meeting. I said I had never heard of it before, but did some homework on it. And what I found was that the rate base is homologous to net asset base. However, rate base is a metric unique and exclusive to the utility industry, and it is used by regulators to determine price increases to the consumer, with the primary motive being that the price which utilities charge the consumer is commensurate with the level of investments they make. Because of this, it seemed to me that using the current rate of inflation to increase the rate base was not in the spirit of the metric, and I would have liked to see a more direct, more transparent method of projecting our needs.
So we have two options. Either if the board is okay with that, we can just say approve the minutes as in the packet with the addition of those comments, and we can add those in, or we can add those comments and put them in the next packet. We're meeting in 2 weeks and we could approve them at that time. So it's up to you, Lauren, how you want to handle that.
Well, can I make a comment here? There's a slight misstatement in that fact, or in the reading. It talked about us increasing the rate base by inflation. We are not increasing the rate base by inflation. The rate base is only increased by net plant additions. Okay, so capital investments. The only place where the inflation comes in is when we're talking about calculating the return on the rate base. Remember when we discussed the 3 to 4%?
Yeah.
And the reason the inflation impacts that number is because that return, okay, the $1 million or $2 million it generates is meant to cover two things. One is debt service, which is not accounted for in the income statement using the utility basis of accounting by FERC. The other thing it has to cover is the difference between the cost of a depreciated asset, which is based on historical cost, okay, the cost when you put the asset into service, say in 2000, and the actual replacement cost in 2024. Inflation happens between historical accumulated depreciation and replacement. There's no other place in the income statement where that cost is accounted for. So the return on rate base is impacted by inflation because of that replacement cost component.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to clarify that.
And thank you for the clarification, Laura. That is actually clear to me, and maybe my comments were not as clear. What I was trying, the basic point is that using the rate base, the return on rate base, it's a Byzantine metric, unique to the utility industry. And I find it not transparent. And I think that the spirit of the return on rate base is to make sure that the increases that the profit margin that the utility gets is commensurate with the investment it makes. So the point I'm making is, in order to avoid a lot of confusion and a lot of discussion that doesn't become go straight to the point, that my recommendation is that we use something different and something more transparent to project budgetary needs.
If I can make a suggestion, I don't want to get too bogged down here in trying to correct these minutes. And we have another meeting in 2 weeks. I think we need to reflect your comment, Bianca, in the minutes, but the comment you read out is more detailed than we normally put in the minutes because we don't put everything everybody said. And so we need to have a way to reflect that in. And if I could suggest, John and Bianca, if you could work on um, getting appropriate comments in the minutes, and then we'll approve them at our next meeting, which is in 2 weeks. Is that okay with everybody? And
Yes, absolutely.
Brian, you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, I think because these are minutes, I think it's more about capturing what was said. And then you can, in the minutes, put some kind of italics or different like something clarifying statement. So you can capture what was said, and then Bianca, Laura, and John can come up to agreed upon definitions that might be more accurate statements of what was meant. And that way we get it done.
Yeah. No, that sounds good. So we will defer approving the minutes at the moment. We'll come back to them in 2 weeks, and John and Bianca, we'll leave it in your hands to send us a version of the minutes that takes out any language that's in there that Bianca's not comfortable in terms of how it reflects what she says, and adds in language that reflects what she did actually say at that meeting. We can't really clarify. Brian makes a good point. Any clarifications made now are not appropriate to put in the minutes because they didn't happen at the meeting last month.
Okay.
Okay,
Uh,
great.
one thing I just want to add, Warren. It is helpful that if a misunderstanding is written down in the minutes, that if we haven't approved it and we still have a correction, to do some other kind of typeface or some kind of note that says the parties agree that these are the definitions, this is the reality. So it's just to capture what happened during the meeting, but we don't want people to read these thinking, oh, well, that's fact, and now later on that fact is been corrected, but they didn't read the next set of minutes that correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Sounds like a deal. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is the chair's report, and my report is brief. I want to wish everybody a happy 2025, and I will turn it over to Jason for his report.
Thank you. I wanted to mention that on December 11th, I attended the second sustainability roundtable that we've had in town. It was over at the library in the Goodwin Forum. I saw Brian there in person, and there might have been many others online. We couldn't really see the participants, but it was well attended, both in person and virtually. I want to thank Eric for hosting that and for putting these together. I think it's a great way to keep the public educated on what the town is doing to work toward the climate action and resilience plan goals. We had a lengthy presentation by CMLP, covered a lot of ground, and it's up on YouTube thanks to Minuteman Media. So if people are interested, you can check it out there. I'm pleased to say that we have a vendor on site. They came yesterday for the first day, and they'll be here through tomorrow, I believe, to make some audiovisual upgrades in the public meeting room. And this will allow us to have hybrid meetings in that room, which would be nice as an opportunity for public forums, board committee meetings, or even trainings. This will allow us to record with multiple different cameras and have some microphones along with some in-room audio, which will help for those people who need to hear what people are saying clearly. The state's Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs has developed options for a clearinghouse that could be stood up in a few years and operational by 2028. And this is conceived as a potential replacement to the Mass Save program, and it may expand its current footprint. So they have been soliciting comments and providing some different listening sessions to get information out and hear feedback. They have reached out to the MLPs, which is nice, and also to some of the organizations that we are part of, like MEME and E&E. And we've been providing comments on how we see that, and they're basically trying to understand if the Mass Save program is adequately meeting all of their goals and if there could be something better. So it's just something to be aware of and to track, because something new like this would have an impact on operations and potentially on the rebates and programs that we offer if we are mandated to be a part of it. So we're just kind of tracking that, those developments at the state level. I wanted to say, unfortunately, we had one of our level 3 chargers at the ride out was vandalized yesterday. Well, it might have been the day before, but just one of the two. We had to take it offline. There's some components broken on it. And we're going to have Flo come out and take a look at that and assess to tell us what we need to do to get it fixed and back online. We did file a police report there on that, and there are no cameras pointed at the stations directly, but there are some nearby in the playground, and we're looking at how we can enhance other security measures to make sure that these expensive investments stay online and available to people. Speaking of Mass Save and those programs, the energy management team has been busy reviewing rebates and the programs that we offer. Mass Save has made some changes. They typically make changes every 3 years, and this is one of those 3-year periods where in 2025 they've made some changes. And so there's a couple changes that we're going to be making, or that have been made effective January 1st, in line with the Mass Save program. And they're both in the CMLP updates in the packet and also on the website, having to do with rebates. And we've been communicating those out to installers so that people know what these small changes will be. And then also we've been working with people who might have had a rebate in the queue or in process before this time, so that they can not have to necessarily follow the new rules. And I've been working with Laura and Jan and their teams to figure out how to make sure that we're equitable with changes in the programs. I attended the school committee meeting and the middle school building committee meetings in December to provide updates on the solar and battery project at the middle school. We've got some other internal meetings planned for that to discuss kind of our options and what we can do to keep this moving forward. Where it's sitting right now is with the superintendent, who has a draft site license and has had that since November. And our goal here is to get basically permission from the school committee to site our equipment on the roof and on the canopies and make sure we have the access needed to connect to the electrical systems and mechanical systems that might be inside or outside the building. Council has advised us that while we can issue an RFP without the site license, there's a lot of risk there. Developers who are interested in projects like this may not want to spend the time issuing or responding to a bid request like this. And even if they do, the bids will likely expire before we can award them, because we can't award them until we have the site license. And so then we would be asking these people to investigate their bids and get all the pricing all over again, which could lead some people to not bid a second time, even if they did the first time. So we're trying to be sensitive to that, but we want to keep moving this along. We do have the RFP ready for the battery as well, which is exciting. And we're just trying to figure out the best way to move forward with that. We will need another site license for that. The first site license is just for the solar. And the feedback that we got both in the meeting and outside the meeting was that the school committee has some questions and concerns, but they're encouraged by the open dialogue and the willingness to find a solution that everybody is comfortable with, including public safety and the state fire marshal's office. So tree trimming bids are expected to be returned by next Tuesday, and that will be for about half the town that will be trimming this year. And it is in the RFP that they will be pausing if they're not completely done by the Patriots' Day celebration week, so that we don't have any concerns with interruptions or police details that are taken up by that work. And they may be done by that time, but if they're not, they'll suspend operations for a brief period of time and then continue afterward. But it definitely should be done in the first half of the year. And then lastly, I just wanted to thank Carol and Donna for all their hard work on implementing the 2025 rates that the board approved last month. Laura has helped out too, and proofing, and several of us will be looking on that process. I believe the deadline for programming and everything to be done is tomorrow, so that the bills can go out or be calculated on Friday. So thank you to those teams who have done that, and I'm happy to answer any questions on that. Warren, you were muted. But
Well, I'll just run
Yeah.
with it. So with the Mass Save replacement program, have they discussed the requirement to be in the REIT, the Renewable Energy Trust with the state? That was the main barrier, because once we joined that, we take on a lot of regulatory burden, a lot of obligations, and there is no way to exit. So that is why all the MLPs, except for 3, have never done it. And those 3 that have done it have regretted it, because they see collection of funds and then those funds not coming back to their service territory.
Yeah, that's a great question. There is a web page that they have. It's called the Mass Building Decarbonization Clearinghouse on mass.gov. And they don't have a ton of information, but they do have a presentation that was given at one of their sessions. There is a feedback form. It's expired, so you can't continue to do that. But there are, I think if you look at the bottom, there's something called Options for Building Decarbonization Clearinghouse, and that has a slide deck. So there may be some information in there, but it's still kind of sparse. And they're really, I think they know that this is going to be a lot of work, and they want to just kind of gauge some feedback at this point. They know there are some things that Mass Save is not doing very well, but it's doing, well in other areas. So they're just trying to see if it's a retrofit of Mass Save that needs to happen or something different. And I think that they're primarily looking at this from the perspective of the applicants and the confusion that's out there, because there's so many different programs. There's federal rebates, state rebates, local rebates. And so the clearinghouse, instead of Mass Save just being like one wing that people have to kind of visit to investigate, they're conceiving this as kind of a higher level thing that would help people navigate all of that to encourage decarbonization. But it's also focusing a lot on the social justice, environmental justice angle, and making sure that some of these programs are equitable to people that maybe hasn't always happened in Mass Save.
Yeah, so that sounds a lot like a reworking of how they disperse funds.
Yeah.
Not so much obligations of being in or out of the program. So that's a good clarifying. The level 3 that was damaged at Rideout, was it they cut the cables for the materials? Was it?
Looks like they took the charging handle out and smashed the screen with it. The screen is definitely broken. Those charging cables, unlike the charge point, can be removed without initiating a session. So the handle itself does not appear to be damaged. So it's possible it was with something else, but the screen is definitely damaged, and it's unsafe because there's exposed components. So we had to power it down. But yeah.
They didn't take anything. They just decided to be idiots and
Yeah.
Okay. The CMS project, when we met at the round table, said we should follow up. I think we really should, because site licenses, I thought the whole point was that CMLP would have an easement, control of a section of property, that area next to the building where we're going to place the battery and other such. So I want to make sure that that's still on track, that we'll be able to operate without having to go to the school committee for everything, because
Right.
that is going to make this project fail if we have to involve a whole group that doesn't know what we're doing and so forth. So
this is just, the one time it would be needed, and it would be for 30 years or something, so that in that period of time, any of the components can be serviced, replaced, examined, inspected, whatever we need to do. But they have to grant some permission initially for us to put equipment on the building and on their property.
okay, that was it. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Cameron?
Well, just a question following up on the middle school, because Jason, you mentioned you need the sort of, you want the permit for the solar to be able to do the RFP. But is the battery, like, you need the battery too, right? So do you need both permits to do the RFP? Do you know what I mean? Because if somebody says, well, wait, okay, I'll do this on the solar, but then you're getting hung up on the battery.
Yeah.
could create the same, like, do you need both in order to do the RFP is I guess my question.
It's a really complex situation, but we don't necessarily need both. So here's why. If we go out to bid and we find that the canopy solar is going to cost $12 million, it's not within the borrowing authorization provided by town meeting, and we wouldn't be able to do it. If we don't do the canopy at the school, then the battery is not required to be on that site because the rooftop could be consumed wholly by that building, even at the kind of peak loads. We're not really worried about that much solar. That's about 400 to 500 kW up there. So the battery does depend on that. Now, in an ideal world, I'd love to have the battery site license too, but there's also considerably more pushback about the concerns about the battery and the safety than there is for the solar. So if we can keep
Right.
things moving in some direction, then that's better than having it all held up. So I think that
Okay.
we're still talking about the other site license, and yes, we'd love to keep that conversation moving too. But I've just heard that they want to do more research before they,
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like go ahead on, if you get the site for the solar, you go ahead, but there is a risk that you do the RFP on the solar and then you come back and go, hey, I can't figure out the battery.
The RFP for the solar is just for the rooftop with an alternate for the canopies. So the canopies are already separated from that conversation. So we'd still be able to move forward in some capacity. So if the canopies are not financially possible, at least with the current borrowing authorization, then we can hold off on that. Remember, we've done all of the.
Okay. So you can do, I guess what you're saying is you can do some solar that
Exactly.
without needing a battery.
Correct.
Got it. Okay. All right. That's really helpful. I mean, I know there's a lot of moving pieces on it, so thanks.
No problem.
So I wanted to raise one thing you didn't discuss that's in your report, and just make a comment, and we don't need to discuss it now. And that has to do with how you've changed the rebates on the heat pumps.
Oh, I did allude to that but yes, I didn't go into the specific details. Yes.
Yeah. I wonder if the new procedure is going to create a odd dynamic where somebody who has an existing heat pump that comprises 20% of their current home or 30% pulls some of the existing installation and takes it down because it's more than the 10% and then reinstalls something, which isn't an efficient way to do it. I wonder whether we should have some procedure on rebates that if someone has an existing heat pump and they now come up with a new installation that brings them to 100%, they can qualify for the whole house rebate, but at a lower level, so that if they have a 20% heat pump now and they go to 100% with a new installation, they don't get the whole $10,000, but maybe they get 80% of it or something.
Yeah, great question. I can assure you that Jan and Laura have thought about this for many, many more hours than they
Yeah.
probably are in 2025. What we have seen is that there are people who previously the whole home was just $10,000, right? So there were people who maybe had a 20% heat pump, but then they got a whole home heat pump system that then put their actual coverage well over the 100% threshold because they wanted the $10,000 rebate and it was more economical to do that. So by changing this to be $3,000 per ton up to $10,000, it's kind of changing that math so that those people aren't necessarily, they can get a sizable rebate without then unnecessarily oversizing their systems just to stretch to get a bigger rebate. And that is one of the Mass Save changes that they've made. And the other thing I'll say is that Mass Save requires that you physically disconnect your auxiliary heating systems or your old other heating systems, whereas CMLP simply mandates that they be used only for emergencies or if, like when your heat pump system is down or if your heat pump system cannot keep up with the load on an unusually cold day. And so this the slight change about requiring, only 10% of supplemental is still more generous than what the Mass Save program has. And it's based on a lot of real world examples and trying to make sure that people aren't dissuaded from going with heat pumps because they're nervous about their ability to fully heat their house in the very cold of winter. But Laura, do you have any other comment? Do you feel like I answered that question? You're muted still.
Yeah, I think you covered it pretty well. I just thinking to Warren's direct question about, if they go from a 20% to 100%, they won't get the whole home, but maybe they get 80% of it. By doing it by ton, right, they will get, a sort of commensurate rebate relative to the tons that were added.
Okay,
Yeah. I mean, I put my system in 2009 and all I got was an AC rebate of like $300. So, this sounds very good.
That's what happens when you're on the bleeding edge, Brian.
thank you. So let's go on to the broadband update.
Sure. I did want to mention that I did speak to Dale about coming to a future meeting. He's been on vacation for 2 weeks and just came back yesterday, and I didn't want to subject him to that because there's been a lot of things that he needed to catch up on, but I will have him visit and give an update soon. The network team has been busy. I'm, again, super excited to report that we have 2 network engineers right now and are fully staffed over there. We are having them look at some security settings and also change the way that certain devices are accessed just to make it more secure and easier to manage when there's employee turnover, so that there's kind of a single sign-on for the hundreds of devices that we have. Right now, there's kind of shared passwords that are kept in a vault. And also looking at the town's Wi-Fi in various areas, including potentially public areas, and then also looking at other ways to separate different networks. So you'll remember that the network engineers support broadband, but they also support the town's network as well. The broadband technicians have been doing a great job under really difficult weather conditions. When there are several days without temperatures above freezing, it can be very difficult to do some troubleshooting and splicing out in the field. Typically, you don't want to splice under 40 degrees, and they've been out there doing a lot of work and repairs in 20-degree or 15-degree weather. We had some splice cases freeze recently that were unable to be opened to make repairs, and so they've had to come up with some pretty creative solutions on that. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention that we're renegotiating some dark fiber leases that we have with different parties that are either expired or going to be expiring soon. You remember that we have fiber that goes all the way around town, and there are several parties like Crown Castle, the school, and the hospital who need fiber from one part of a town to another. And if we have that spare fiber, we will lease it to them because it's being unused. And we have limited numbers of these types of leases, but it is a revenue stream, especially for fiber that we're not using. And so we've got some that are expiring or have recently expired. And so there's a lot of work going on between the finance team and the broadband team to understand costs and do better estimates, because some of these were negotiated 10 years ago plus, and they just needed to take a fresh look at them. And that's all I've got for broadband.
Any questions or comments? Well, thanks very much. Let's go on to the main topic of the meeting. We're now moving into our main topic for the year 2025, which is going to be the transition to time of use rates. And to get us all on the same page as a starting point, because not all board members were here for prior discussions of this topic, we're going to have a presentation about the background and purpose of time of use rates and what's been discussed up till now in past years. So who's going to be doing this?
I'll give this presentation. Laura's gonna lead the other 2 presentations.
Okay, great.
Co-lead the middle one there. So thank you, Warren. That was an excellent overview and setup of what we're trying to do. So I don't need to really say anything else other than to jump right into it. So you'll note, and these rates I have down here are from last year, the 2024 rates, because we made the slides in November. But right now, the way we are charging for electricity is is meant to encourage less consumption. Basically, we charge more for the more energy you use. And you can see here that it's almost 8 cents per kilowatt for anything in excess of 835 kilowatt hours. And so you're going to pay more the more electricity you use. But Concord has made a decision to green our power supply and decarbonize it. And by doing that, what would really help decarbonization globally is if people actually used more electricity and shifted their fossil fuel usage for their vehicles and their home heating and other things away from fossil fuels and over to electricity. And so our rate structure really isn't incentivizing that type of behavior. So, and I'll just note that since 2023, 100% of Concord's electricity has been non-emitting sourced power. So to cut these greenhouse gas emissions, we do need to shift to electrification, and customers should not have to pay more for using more electricity because we're trying to incentivize that. So if the amount you use is not the variable, then how do we price electricity so that it is more reflective of the costs that drive power supply and transmission? So the energy costs that we charge customers are meant to be revenue neutral. That's why we have the PCA charge. It can help us correct if we've under or overestimated the cost of power. So if for some reason power supply costs jump, that increase in power supply costs are spread equally to all customers so that everybody is having to pay for that. And it also means that we know that power gets very expensive at some times, and any reduction in that peak usage, even a little bit, is going to have a dramatic impact on the savings for all customers. And then we also know that with this increased electrification that we're seeing, not just here in Concord, not just in Massachusetts, but in New England, in the nation, worldwide, is that the transmission system that exists today is not adequate for the amount of electricity that we will need to fully electrify everything. So those transmission costs, in part because some systems just have to be upgraded and costs now or are maintained, and those costs now are more expensive than they were when they were installed. But we also need new transmission lines or ways to get more electricity in the same transmission lines. So those costs we know are going to go up, and they're anticipated to go up pretty steeply. So on my next slide here, I just have a day where you can see the LMP price jumping kind of in the early evening. I think it's around the 6 o'clock hour in the evening that it jumps up to here to $214. So that corresponds to a 550% increase over what you were seeing earlier, maybe at midnight. LMP is the locational marginal price. So we're paying that. Now, this is because we need more supply at that time, and we need people to turn on generation sources that cost more to run. So they don't want to run them when electricity is cheap. They want to run them when it's expensive. They also may not be licensed or authorized to run these systems all year long, and as such, they can be much dirtier systems. And typically, you're seeing a lot of diesel generation during these times. So using this electricity at this time is costing more money for us to procure it, and it's also releasing more carbon into the atmosphere, maybe even other dirtier things than carbon. So we definitely have an incentive to steer away from this. It's costing all of our ratepayers a lot of money.
Hey, Jason, before you go on, is that a typical day or an unusual day?
The summer day, and it's definitely when we have probably a warm weather event here. But this is not every day, but every day does have a curve like this where supply and demand suggests that there's an expensive part of the day and there's a cheap part of the day. So in the winter, the curve looks different than the summer, but we still have the same situation where we have cheaper costs at some part of the day and more expensive costs in another part of the day. And when we look to develop a time of use strategy and we do a cost of service study, we'll be looking at those periods of time which we know are historically more expensive. We'll be calling those the super peak or peak, and then the times where it's very inexpensive, we'll be calling those off peak. So yes, that's a great question. So what are some of the goals that we would have for setting up a time of use system. So, and remember, what we're going for is a default opt-out time of use. In other words, we would apply this rate to everybody in town, and only those systems that don't have the right equipment would be on some other rate. It would be a small number of people. So number one, we want to more closely align the cost for electricity to what we pay for it. Right now, as we pointed out, there's times where electricity is much cheaper than what we are charging a customer, and times where it's much, much, much more expensive than what we are charging for customers. And that is kind of all leveled out, and everybody is kind of bearing those costs and benefits. So it is important to understand that even a small number of people shifting their load will have a pretty big impact on all customers. We also want to look at lowering prices for customers. We know that energy costs are rising, that all costs are rising. Inflation has been high for the last couple of years. And setting up a system like this will create a lot of savings for CMLP overall and allow us to hopefully lower our rates. And then we also want to make sure that we're allowing the people who are already making decisions and investments that save them money to continue to support our efforts to decarbonize. So there are people who have a stake in this game, and they are already investing. There are people who put rooftop solar when they had very few rebates available, people who have done heat pumps because they know it's what they want to do to decarbonize. And we want to just make sure that those investments are supported by the rate structure that we have here at CMLP. So you might say, like, why isn't everybody on time of use, and is this just a simple thing to do? I have here a nice slide that illustrates the simple concept, but difficult execution and education. There are a million different ways that you could structure a time of use program. I've got some charts here from different utilities that show kind of what their outreach and education system has been. And it can be really hard for the average homeowner who doesn't really spend much time thinking about their electricity to comprehend what these programs mean, and also knowing that there is some variability both during the day and during the season as to when they need to be aware that electricity costs more. And it's definitely going to be on us to make sure that we provide as much information and education as we can to customers, and also equip them with tools that will help them better understand their load, their usage, and what they can do to maybe shift to times where it's more economical. I will say 50% of public utilities offer a time of use rate, but only about 4% of customers nationwide are actually on them. And a lot of programs to date have been kind of optional or pilot programs. I will also mention that we couldn't do time of use before because we needed these advanced meters that we have been deploying to collect the granular data that will allow us to appropriately charge people for different usage at different times of the day. So walking through just kind of a brief history back to 2017, when we did the first strategic plan push, we had identified the time of use rate as an important component of our future goals to help for all the reasons that I've already mentioned, and that it would be an opt-out program. And there were kind of some ideas about that here. Those were preliminary, and again, as we've discussed with any board decision, it's really the current board that decides, not the past board, but these were just some ideas that were thrown around out there. When we did the 2020 rate redesign or the cost of service study with Baker Tilly, it was noted as a high priority goal. You can see here it's the first one, sending a price signal to kind of move away from that expensive and dirty power. You'll see in the 2021 light board goals that they had that number 5 there highlighted, which was develop board competency and knowledge of time of use rates to inform better policy and rate decisions. In 2023, Brian gave an excellent presentation on time of use rates and kind of what the opportunity was. And I have a good quote here that summarizes that I believe Brian said that we need a rate structure that is unsubsidized, fair to the other customers, but also rewards those that are doing the investments that we need to level the load. So people are already helping solve this problem, and they're shifting their usage away. They're generating electricity. So we just need to make sure that we have programs that continue that behavior and support it. In the Climate Action and Resilience Plan that was in 2020, there were some lofty goals about reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. And time of use rates were a really big component of the plan. If you'll see here, there's a screenshot from the implementation blueprint section of the plan. And it was one of CMLP's primary goals was rate redesign that had a default opt-out time of use rate. So let's go over a little bit of kind of what we've decided, where we are, and then what questions will remain and that the board will need to figure out over the next few months, several months, as we look to implement this in about a year. So number one, that we're doing it all, right? We're on this path. We've been working toward this for many years. We've also understand that the purpose and the motivation of this is all the reasons stated in the beginning of this presentation. Another thing is, there's a question, if you look at different policies, I think Laura mentioned how the state of Hawaii, when they did time of use rates, initially they didn't have any data, but they knew they wanted to sort of shape some behavior. So they just kind of picked rates and tried to make the peak rates very expensive. We're trying to tie this to actual costs. So the more data that we can have, the better our rates will be tied to the actual costs that we incur. We're not simply trying to adopt a program to affect behavior. We're trying to create rates that are pegged to the costs that we incur for providing that electricity. And we also want to keep this as simple as possible. We could create 14 buckets during the day to be more precise with how electricity costs fluctuate. We could change things based on the real-time, costs that we're seeing from ISO. We don't want to go that far, so we're trying to keep this as simple but as representative of true costs as we can. And then that we want to make sure that we do extensive outreach and education to customers so that we can allow them and empower them to find ways to save money, because the average person who even tries a tiny bit could save under a time of use rate. And hopefully once time of use is out there and more people are shifting their usage away from peak rates, even if you did nothing, your electricity costs should be going down because CMLP's cost to purchase energy will go down. So what are some of the questions that remain? We've got a lot of rates today, and there's a question about how those current rates integrate into the time of use rates. Are some of them kind of folded into time of use, or do they remain afterwards? So the light board will need to go through those. And in our time of use schedule, which we've debuted back in November, or even before that, October, I believe. We highlighted some of those questions and the timeline that Laura presented. So we need to figure that out. What will the opt-out rate structure be? So we have some customers who will not have meters that will allow them to be on time of use rate. So we know we have that. The opt-out rate is not intended to be punitive, but it does need to capture sort of the unknown costs, right? Because that person could be using all their energy during the peak, which is costing other ratepayers a lot of money, or they may not be, but we need to figure out a fair way to adequately charge for the opt-out rate. How are we addressing solar net metering? This was a question even before time of use rates. We've kind of punted it because we knew we were doing a massive rate redesign, but we do need to start talking about that. And, depending on how our meeting with Warren goes, setting the agenda, we may be talking about that later this month as kind of an introduction, but we'll need to kind of figure out how that works. And then historically, there was a commitment, as you'll probably saw on one of the strategic plan slides, to increase the fixed monthly charge. We did just do that from $18.50 to $20, but there's an indication that maybe the board doesn't want to just continue increasing it. So we'll just need to figure out what the strategy is there, because again, the more we collect in fixed charges, the more that affects what we charge for energy and the other component of the bill. So we just need to understand that piece. And then a couple other things, the interval that we're collecting transmission and capacity costs. I do feel like we could roll those into one word and say ourselves sometimes. They're very different things, but we say them so often together. So how long are the periods that we actually use to calculate? And then the level of detail on the bills, which we're going to be segueing into right after this conversation. And then, what are some of the best practices that we can learn from the other people who've already gone down this path so that we don't repeat some mistakes? And we're going to be doing that throughout the year, is to try to show folks what other utilities have done successfully and unsuccessfully and some of those lessons learned. So that was my last slide, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And my hope, and Warren, it's really up to you, but my hope is that we can have some great discussion among board members and share some thoughts on what the presentation is. It wasn't meant to be just a passive thing, like thank you, move on.
Yeah.
I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so this is probably not the time for board members to make their proposals and present their ideas on how to address the unresolved issues. But we want to make sure everybody's at the same page in terms of understanding the purpose of time of use rates, the background. Any questions or comments on what's happened in the past or why we're doing this? That was a very good presentation, Jason. It covered it very well, and I think does bring us up to date.
I
But
agree. That's the only comment, just to keep, I would agree. That's a good summary of a decade.
yeah.
And
And
the investments into the metering system and the billing system have been towards this goal. So, this is a long process.
yeah, and I think we all have to realize there are a lot of questions that remain unresolved that are going to take a lot of attention on the part of the board over quite a few months here. But this was just for background. So if no one has any other questions or comments,
I guess, Warren,
John.
I would just offer one comment, and I think Jason did a great job of bringing this issue out. But I feel like the tension we're going to have in this process is that between kind of balancing the objective of simplicity and the objective of trying to get the price right, to provide the appropriate, price signals to customers. And I think that's going to be really hard and something that we're going to spend a lot of our time kind of hopefully coming up with the correct solutions for.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, especially because, as Jason mentioned in his presentation, the peak doesn't occur at the same time in all seasons and in the same way. And so that makes the goal of simplicity not so easy to achieve. But we should be aiming for that, as you suggest, John. Well, let's then actually get into the work, and we have another presentation that relates to a specific aspect of this.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to just tee this off and then hand it over to Laura. The reason why we're talking about how the bills look so early is that our vendor, NISC, who makes our billing software, iView, they require about 6 months to complete comprehensive bill changes like this, because we're not just moving things around in the bill and we're not just changing one rate out for another. This is going to be a whole different billing situation and also a different presentation with different calculations that are on the bill. So we are hoping that we can kind of kick that process off February timeframe, so that by the fall we have that whole system done and can start the pilot billing so that we can see real world examples of what that looks like. So what we're hoping to do is get some very, well, actually, let me just get to the first slide and then I'll explain what we're hoping to do. So the current bills, and I've highlighted this down here, they break out capacity, transmission, distribution, and energy charges for each kilowatt hour sold, so that you can see which components of your bill make up each of those different buckets. And those rates are set for different reasons, and the cost of service model that we use every year to put our revenue requirements through to spit out what these various things do. And we had some great discussion at the last meeting on rates, on which ones of these should end up collecting, the various things that don't change, which ones should be reflective of the actual costs. And anyway, this is a very helpful way for people to understand what the components of their bill are. If we simply just said the prices are this per kilowatt hour, it wouldn't really tell the same story. So I think this has been very helpful for customers to see that, to understand what their bill charges are. But with time of use, it's going to really complicate the bill if we continue to break out these things in this exact way. And the bill is going to get pretty messy with a lot of data that's possible. So what we're hoping to do is just to get some pretty broad recommendations from the board on the direction that they'd like to see. And so in our presentation, we're going to go through some examples and talk through the benefits and drawbacks of including certain things or not including other things. And we've also tried to think of some novel ways to retain the characteristics of the bill that we like, but also maybe not overcrowd it and make it too confusing for customers. So that is the challenge. And I think John highlighted it perfectly. And we're going to get it right into it with this first presentation, which is how do we keep things simple enough to understand for the average customer, but also pack in as much information as we can get so that they can make those changes to help save themselves money on their bills. So, Laura, I'll kick it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Jason, for that introduction. So basically the ask is today from the board are really just two high level decisions on the bill. One is whether or not we continue to break out the bill elements for energy, number one, capacity and transmission, number two, and distribution, number three, for each time period, keeping in mind that we anticipate having at least 3 time periods, at least in the summer. So, should we continue to break those out either into the 3 buckets that we currently have, maybe consolidating it into 2 buckets, or further consolidating it just into one number per time period that encapsulates all 3 of those cost types? So that's the question number one. And we're going to show you some bill examples from these utilities you see about how they've handled it. And then the second question is going to be, if you go back one slide, Jason, you can see on our bills, we show the last 12 months of usage. It's pretty small, but that bar chart goes from November to November, so people can see how their energy use has varied by month. And so what we're going to ask you to decide is, should we continue to try to show 1 year's worth of information, recognizing that we're going to either have to do a stacked bar chart or some other way to show the complexity of the different, how much people used on peak, off peak, and mid peak for each of the time periods we're trying to reflect in the chart. So basically, do we keep a year or do we go down to a month? So those are the 2 things we're going to ask you to decide today. And we're going to show you some examples. So the first one is Sacramento Municipal Utility District. They were one of the first utilities to go to an opt-out time of use rate back in 2018. The bill sample that they have on their website just has 2 time periods rather than 3, because I believe it is a, what date is this? Yeah, it's a winter bill, so they only have 2 time periods. But what they've done on theirs is they only show one cost per time period. You can see it says electric usage, 431 off peak, and that's at 11.5 cents, and 130 on peak, and that's at a combined 15.9 cents. So they don't try to break out the 11.5 cents into the different components of energy, capacity, and transmission. They just roll it all up into one number. And you can see that their chart on the left just shows the prior month only. They have 2 charts. One shows the cost per time period in dollars, and the other one shows how much people used, the volume that they used by on and off peak for the previous month. So that's one example. The next one is Toronto Hydro. They've got 3 time periods, on, mid, and off. And again, you can see highlighted in yellow that each time period has just one rate associated with it, with no breakout. They have 2 charts. One shows only total kilowatt hours in the past 12 months, so not a breakout into how much was on, off, and mid-peak, just total. But then they do show the breakout of kWh per time period just for the last month and a year ago. So if you look at number 13, I recognize it's a little small, but they're showing 3 side-by-side bars showing how much was used for each time period. And the one on the left is for the current period, and the set of of bars on the right is for the same period 1 year ago. So that's kind of an interesting way to do it, where they tried to get last 12 in there, as well as last month, but give some view of a year ago and how this year looks different. The next one is Kankakee Valley. This one, again, is highlighted in yellow, just one charge per time period. It's a single bundled rate. The chart shows the last 12 months. It shows just total kilowatt hours delivered for the last 12 months. And then in this case, it must be a solar customer because they're also showing the generation credit for the past 12 months. And the other thing they do, which we like because we have it on our current bills, you can see they have the meter register readings. That's that section up at the top that says right below account number. And it shows for each, one is how much they're using and the other one is how much they're generating from their solar. And it shows the meter number, the meter reading dates from to, how many days it covered, and then the recorded usage. The next one is Hendrix Power, and they also show in yellow just one line item per time period, the single bundled rate. The chart shows the last 12 months in clustered columns, so side by side. You have just 2 time periods in this chart. One is on peak and one is off peak. So you can see the dark blue is off peak and then the light blue, or excuse me, the dark blue is on peak and the light blue is off peak, and they're showed side by side, which makes kind of a busy chart. And if we have 3 time periods, this clustered column method might not work that well. They also show meter register readings in the section below the account number again. The next one is Cobb EMC. They only show one line item per time period in a single bundled rate. They have a really cool chart. It gets all the way through the last 12 months, and it shows the on, off, and super off peak breakout in stacked columns. So that seems to me like a way that you can get cake and eat it too. You can get a full year's worth of data, but you can also show the detail. And the next one is Southern California Edison. Now this one is interesting. You know, they are an IOU, and so they have open access. People can choose a different electricity supplier, even though Southern California Edison is the only place to purchase the delivery services for. So they actually break out costs by delivery and energy charges. And again, they do within those 2 buckets, they just show one line item per time period for each charge type in a single bundled rate. And
Hey, Laura, before you go forward, on this bill and on a previous one, those numbers in circles 19, 20, 21, so on, do those actually appear on the bill or?
no, so these are from sort of how to read your bill pages, where it's on the web and there are notes down below. So under 19,
Okay,
it'll
that's what I
say,
assumed. I just wanted to confirm
yes,
that.
yeah, good question.
Okay.
And on this one, the one chart shows the last 12 months, but only again for total usage and not a breakout. Into the peak, on peak, and off peak, or excuse me, on peak, mid peak, and off peak time periods. I think that might be the last example. Jason, do you want to talk about this one?
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that we're trying to pack a lot of information. I think Laura showed different options about ways to show both the current month versus last month, or maybe the same month a year ago in more detail, but also kind of a 12-month history, which seems to be helpful and popular for people to see on their bills. But I would mention too that we have other ways to get even more information to customers. So if we do end up not breaking down their specific usage of distribution, capacity transmission, and energy, we could at least provide a static example of for one kilowatt hour, what comprises that charge on the off, mid, and high peak. So an example here on these pie charts, right? So that's one example. There's a million, but just to show a person what each kilowatt hour is comprised of in terms of charge. Or we can also provide a QR code or a URL, concordma.gov/bill, whatever it is, something simple where people can go for a really detailed explainer that might have a lot of other information and tutorials. So if we're stuck between trying to make something simple but also provide a lot of information, remember that there are other tools that people are quite familiar with that can help provide even more background or context or information. So we don't want to not provide any information to customers. We're just trying to make the bills readable and simple.
So again, as I mentioned in the beginning, what the two decisions we're looking to get from the board today, because of the lead time that we need to get NIC to start software updates on this bill print, is to decide whether or not to collapse the current breakout of energy, capacity and transmission, and distribution into one price per time period, or to continue to show some type of breakout per time period, either in the three buckets we showed today, combined, maybe you do energy and then capacity, transmission, and distribution as another one, or just get it down to one. So that's one question. And then the other question is, again, for simplicity's sake, do we want to show the graph of total use, or do we want to try to capture how much was used by time period? And do we do it for just the last month or for the last 12 months? So that's what we're hoping to get from you today. Thank you.
Thank you. And Bianca had a hand up.
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna say I really liked the presentation, and I guess in response to these last questions, my vote, or my thought, I should say, not a vote, is that just collapse the prices, because you want to have, I think from a consumer perspective, I don't think people really understand what capacity charges are, distribution charges, just like the price, whatever they're paying, that's what's going to matter. And some history is good. I think at minimum the last month, but I think that QR code is fabulous. Like if you want to see, 12 months worth of data, you can click on the QR code and go back. But for the bill, maybe just the last month, just to keep it simple, straightforward. Like this is what you did last year. This is the opportunity for you to do this year. So that's it.
Thank you. Brian.
Thanks. I have plenty of thoughts. So I agree with collapsing the power supply categories under the on, mid, and off peak. So that would be the energy, capacity, and transmission. On the bill, they can appear as on peak, mid peak, and off peak. The correct mix for each of those. Distribution, the variable distribution, I would like to still list separately, so that when we get to our discussions about solar, you can clearly see in the bill that you'll be credited only the on, off, or mid peak, and you won't be credited for the cost of operating the plant. So I think that's important. The other thing I would suggest while we're talking about how the bill looks, we've talked in the past about the $20 fixed collection, breaking that into the $6.50 meter fee and the fixed collection method for distribution fees. And I would suggest placing the variable distribution and fixed distribution collection right next to each other on the layout of the bill. Laura, does that make sense?
I think I understand the first, you want to still show, you want to collapse energy, capacity and transmission into one price and still show distribution separately by time period.
I want to show distribution, variable distribution over month-long period. And the on and mid peak and off peak is their consumption during those hours. So if, for example, if someone consumed 835 kilowatt hours in a month and they consumed 500 of that off peak, 300 of that mid peak, and 35 of that on peak, then their bill would say they got 835 as a variable distribution fee. They would got a on peak of 35 kilowatts, a mid peak of 300 kilowatts, and an off peak of 500 kilowatts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we can go over that in more detail of exactly what you're looking for, but I think you want to break out distribution once and then one price for each time period after that.
Yes.
Now, that is assuming that the cost of service study consultant is going to continue to believe that distribution should be allocated equally across all time periods. I know you might think it should be, but there are some questions about sizing of the equipment for peak delivery. And
Okay.
so there might be an opinion that they would believe that there should be different distribution fees for each time period. We saw in one of our examples that Jason put together that some utilities do that.
Okay. If that was the case, I would suggest that cost be put into the on, off, mid.
Okay.
Is the idea of the fixed collection, the meter fee, and the variable distribution fee is to collect all the things we budget for that we know we have to pay for each year. So it's the fixed expense collection methods. And I want to make sure that the amount people consume is one way of collection, and then the variable, the when, is those on off peak. So if an expense is when, then it goes into those. If currently we label that as distribution and that odd case happens, and they go into the on off mid peaks.
What would you think, Brian, if we only did this breakout of distribution for solar bills?
Yeah, Laura, before we get into, let's hear some other
Okay.
comment. Let's hear what John had to say and then come back to that.
Yeah, that's where I was headed as well. But so in terms of the questions as posed, I agree with the proposal to collapse each of the three different charges and not necessarily break them out in terms of transmission, capacity, distribution, and energy. And Brian, I'm thinking that, as Laura's suggesting, that maybe one way to address it would be just through a separate rate for solar PV customers. But that's something we can discuss.
One of the main goals of this is to make a rate that works for all situations and not have a separate solar or separate bidirectional rate. We want our rate to encapsulate that. So I don't think I would be against a separate rate because I want simplicity and I want flexibility in the default rate structure.
I think that, right, there's a balance here, and we might not be able to resolve it today. There's the balance in terms of simplicity from customers being able to understand their bills and to really be able to provide strong price signals, and use simplicity to kind of send that appropriate price signal.
Yeah.
And that's kind of that's where I end up. And I feel like one possibility we have here in terms of to balance simplicity with providing appropriate price signals would be to, indulge in complexity by having different rates for different customers depending on their specific configuration. So if a customer has a heat pump and they have, for example, gas backup, they might appropriately have a different rate structure than a customer that didn't have a heat pump, because their consumption profile is going to be different and their ability to kind of
We,
reduce consumption. But I'm just throwing out proposals there. The
Yeah, so
final.
Brian, we're just, let me go on to Bianca.
Okay, just the final question that was posed was 12 months or 1 month. My preference would be for 12 months to really provide a full year, and if possible to similar to that one utility that broke it out by the 3 different periods. I think that's useful information, will help them in terms of understanding why their bill might vary over the course of the year.
Bianca.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest a lot of these things, like with the QR code that was mentioned in the presentation, we could put a headline like "want to know more," need more details. You could go click into there for the energy capacity distribution breakdown, or the 12-month period or whatever, but just so not to because I would say that the average customer is going, I'm currently overwhelmed with the bill as it is. I look at my bill and I can't make heads or tails of it. And so I imagine with the time of use rates, the average customer, the more detail you provide, the more questions, the more confusion. And I think we want to just eliminate the confusion. And then for the sophisticated customer, hey, click the QR code.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I agree with that as well. And I think it's a question not just of what goes on the bill, but how. In terms of the what, I'm with at least some of the folks here in thinking that everything should be collapsed into just energy and everything else. And what I meant, but not just what, but how, there's a very big difference between the readability of those different examples Laura showed. They all had pretty similar information, but some of them were very hard to read. And the ones that were more graphical, that made it, that very clearly presented, hey, here's what your bill's divided into these 3 periods, and here's what you paid in each of those 3 periods. That's the key information people need. Secondly, I'm also for having 12 months on the bill. I like that, as long as it's not too complicated to do on the back end. I like that graph with the 3 colors of the 3 different periods, but showing a year. When I think of what's the information that people need to know most, first is how much are they charged for electricity at different times of the day. They also need to know, when are those different times of the day. Most of those bills don't say when off-peak and on-peak is. I think that's important information. And then the next thing is, how has their electricity use changed over time? We can't expect people to go back to their bills to compare this month to 6 months ago. So I think that historic information is important. Brian.
I agree. If you look at the example for Southern California Edison, I love that graph. It's simple. It shows 14 months, so 3 Septembers and a full year. And all it does is show the consumption from the customer. It doesn't show the generation sent.
Jason, can you put that graph up while Brian's talking about it?
Yep,
Yeah.
I'm working on that right now.
So it's black and white, with black being the build month for the last 3 years, and then it has gray for the months in between in the last 12. And it just shows the total consumption. It doesn't go into the colors of when. It doesn't give that information in the graph. And I think for on the bill, that's good. I love the idea of a QR code for the people who want a detailed breakdown and this, something focused on understanding more about usage, but not having it on everybody's bill. As for, I did want to follow up on John's comment about separate rates. This board in 2009 really went down that path, and we had something like 35 special rates. We had lots of, our cost of service studies came back saying that, hey, there's potential risk here where you're treating different groups of customers in different ways, and they're not all done using the same philosophy. So you're showing bias. Again, a big driver of this is to create one default rate that focuses on the flow of energy back and forth through the meter and sends that to customers. And I'll mock up what I'm thinking about, and I'll send it to Jason and Laura and Warren, and they can share it with the rest of you if they wish. I don't want to make this a open meeting problem. So and I haven't put it together, so I can't show you right now. But I think it is pretty simple in the bill, and I don't think it's overly complex. And to take distribution out of the collapse and so forth.
Brian,
So,
I'm probably thick and don't understand this.
Oh,
I'm
you're
not sure why it matters to customers to have distribution broken out.
two big reasons. Non-solar customers want to see how much energy did I consume over the month period without doing the effort of it adding up the 3 different time periods. The second is that with solar customers, the big concern is about collecting the cost of that customer, and that's what distribution does. And if we're going to do any kind of credits, it should be on when the power flow is going back and forth. So putting capacity, transmission, and energy into those peak listings and then crediting based off that, make sure that the light plant's kept whole for solar customers. And
Yeah, but that seems an important issue for us to understand when setting rates. I'm not sure why the average solar customer needs that information broken down. What they need to know is how much generation did they have in the month and what are they being charged?
So we're in threat of going into a full how do we do TOU solar discussion, and I know that Laura has wanted to talk about that specifically, but how it appears in the bill, I've already got ideas on that, and this is important in how it appears in the bill. I don't want to open that discussion about shouldn't we, how do we treat solar under TOU, because we'll get really distracted.
Okay. So John, you were going to say something, or are you passing?
I was not going to say, I just was supporting the point you were making, Warren, that I feel like a lot of these considerations go into the design of the rate and aren't necessary to convey to customers on their bill, because I think it just adds complexity and potentially creates confusion.
So let me ask a question for Laura and Jason. It seems like we're in general sense that we want to compress the categories to some extent. Whether distribution remains on there or not is an open question, and we probably need to defer that till we have the discussion of solar. And we want to have 12 months of data on the bill, but how that's presented, that's an open question. Is that enough information for you to get started, or do you need us to resolve anything more today?
Oh, go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, so we actually do need both of these votes on these two questions to move forward. We can't defer it until we talk about solar with time of use, only because we need to submit this work order in February. So I feel like we could use the second meeting in January to finalize this if there's not an agreement today, but that we would need to have a full understanding of what we want presented on the bills in order to put the request in.
Okay.
Could I provide a mock-up at our next meeting in 2 weeks?
Brian, what I would like to suggest is anybody on the board who wants to submit comments on this topic before the next meeting should send them to Jason and Laura. And what I would encourage, you may want to provide a mock-up, that's fine, but what I would encourage everybody on the board to do is look at those examples in the packet and send some comments of things you like or don't like from some of them and present those. And if Jason and Laura at the next board meeting, you could present a compilation of any comments you got from any board members.
I think we can do that.
Sounds good.
Anything else we should say on this topic before we move along? Good. Well, there are some questions we haven't resolved, but generally, it seems like we're moving in a compatible direction here. So let's go on to our power supply.
Yes, so I've got this presentation queued up and I'll just hand it right over to Laura.
Okay, thank you. So Brian Folds had requested that we share some more detailed information about what CMLP's loads look like at different times of the year and how those differences in load impact what we pay for power. If you go to the first slide, Jason, oh, that's the first slide. Okay. So really what we're trying to do here is create a connection between when power is used and how much it costs so that you can understand how TOU prices could result in the lowering of bills for our customers. That's really the main point here. Brian, wanted to get across that the main purpose of TOU is actually to lower prices and lower costs for everybody. So I think the first comment I want to make about CMLP load is that we are a summer peaking utility, which means we have higher loads in the summer than we do in the winter. That may change with heat pumps, but currently this shows the maximum hourly load by month for the period from 2006 to 2024. You can see in the summer, historically, we've used as much as 45 megawatts during the maximum hour, whereas a shoulder month like October, our maximum is generally under 30. Next slide. So although individual years vary based on the weather, there was a downward trend in the maximum hourly load between 2006 and 2017. During which time the peak hourly usage declined about 17% on a weather normalized basis. However, since 2017, the trend has been a very slight increase of 4% over that period on a weather normalized basis. So I think, this is a function of electrification that we're seeing and maybe some economic growth, but we really haven't seen population growth that could be playing into this. The 2024 numbers are preliminary because we won't find out what our actual peak was. Oh, no, sorry, this is the non-coincident peak. So actually that is a final number for 2024. It says preliminary, but it's not. Okay, next slide.
Warren, do you want to take questions during the presentation or wait till the end?
Laura, can you take questions?
Yes.
during?
Yeah, it's just a quick comment. 2013
Oh,
was
I didn't-
2013 was the solar challenge. That's a big driver for those 2013 to 2017. beyond 2017, there's a decline when WR Grace came on. But once our solar installations slowed, things kind of leveled out, and you can see that electrification. So solar had a big impact in those earlier years.
Thank you.
Speaking about putting utility scale solar onto the system, the biggest impact the addition of the WR Grace facility had was actually not on maximum loads, but on minimum loads. This shows the minimum megawatts that we were using during the lowest hour for each one of these years. And you can see that whereas our lows were more like 12 megawatts before the addition of WR Grace in 2016, that dropped to 6 to 8 after the addition of the large 4.5 megawatt solar facility in 2016. That was a 52% drop between 2006 and 2024. Next slide. Okay. Here, what this shows, each one of these charts is a month. So 1 is January, 2 is February, 3 is March. And what you can see and I showed it in this first slide, these are winter months: Jan, Feb, March, April, October, November, December. Our load looks like a double hump, like a Bactrian camel, where there's a lower load in the morning, and then a larger hump occurs in the evening. These are averages. They're averages over a long time period. On any individual day, for example, the morning hump can be much larger than the evening hump if we had cold weather overnight, but then it warms up during the day. It really depends on the temperature variation throughout the day. But this double hump pattern is characteristic of winter months. The next slide. In contrast, summer months look more like our single hump camel, where there's sort of a slow rise throughout the day, and the peak happens sometime around 6 p.m. You can see in the pure summer months like July and August, it's a pure slow rise during the day, whereas in May and September you can see just slight evidence of that morning hump still evident based on the temperatures.
Laura,
John has a question.
yeah, it just seems like what we're talking about here, are we talking about the net system load shape, or are we talking about, total peak load? And it
We are
seems like,
talking,
right, if solar is considered, then the shape is going to differ considerably.
so what this shows is our what is called net energy for load. It's basically our imports from the ISO system, because we don't have a way to measure total load, right? We don't know how much solar is, what the total load is that the solar is reducing. We have some estimates of what the solar production is, but this is basically what our imports were.
And these are actual load shapes, because I'm somewhat surprised. I would think that there would be more of a, as you know, of a duck curve shape, given the solar production that we'd expect to see.
Again, these are averages over the 2006 to 2024 period, so it includes time periods when solar wasn't as big a factor.
Got it. Got it. And I think I guess I would just make the point. I think that that's going to be an important driver and cost driver here.
Yeah, and I think certainly when we discuss solar net metering under time of use, we can look at some of that more recent data and see how these load shapes have changed over time.
You definitely do see it in May and September a little bit more than the peak summer months, but yeah. Next slide.
Yep, please. Okay, this is a chart that shows load variability by month. The gray bars are what our average load is during each one of the months of the year. And then the blue line, the top of it, shows the maximum during that month. And the bottom of the blue line shows the minimum. So the months where the differential between the high and the low is very high, like in June, when our highest load, almost close to 40 megawatts, is 29 megawatts higher than our lowest load at 10 megawatts. That's very costly to serve that load because we have to have generation standing by to meet the 29 megawatts of maximum load. And yet during portions of the month, we're wasting, 29 megawatts because we don't need it during the minimum hours. So months with a smaller differential, like October, are much cheaper to serve. So you can see again, because we're a summer peaking system, the summer has higher variability than the winter. Next slide. So we've been looking at CMLP's minimum and maximum loads over time. However, the costs that are imposed by the ISO New England for transmission and capacity are based not on when CMLP peaks, but rather on what CMLP's load is during the hour that the wider grid peaks. And those are not always the same thing. CMLP actually tends to peak later. So very often the wider grid peak will be from 5 to 6 p.m. and whereas CMLP's actual peak was from 6 to 7. But the ISO doesn't use our maximum. They only look at what our load was during the hour that they say the grid peaked. And to give you some idea about what these costs are, capacity and transmission used to be much more equal. In fact, there were times when capacity cost more than transmission. Nowadays, the capacity cost is about $4 per kilowatt per month. The transmission is closer to 16. And the ways, excuse me, that these costs are assessed is capacity is based on the single hour of the year when the entire New England region peaks. So the ISO will come out and say, okay, the peak for 2024 was on July 9th between 5 and 6 p.m. So everybody, we're going to go look at what you were using during that hour, and we're going to multiply it by $4 per kilowatt month, and that's what you're going to pay for capacity. Transmission, on the other hand, is allocated differently. They don't look at the maximum peak hour per year. They do it 12 times. They look at the maximum peak hour per month and multiply that by 16. And that one's based not on when the New England system peaks, but when our local regional system peaks. So for CMLP, that's the northeastern Massachusetts, Boston regional area of the ISO grid. So whenever that subsystem peaks is when they're going to look and see what our load was and multiply it by 16. So the question is, when does the grid peak? Next slide. So peaks basically have been occurring later in the day over time. And this does show the effect of solar, because when the peaks were happening at 2 to 3 p.m. in 2008, that hour ending 15 means 2 to 3 p.m. There's quite a bit of solar that's produced between 2 and 3 p.m. So now the solar reduced the load of the system. So that's no longer the peak anymore. And the peaks start happening later in the day when there's not as much solar around to offset the load. So that's why you see these peaks occurring later in the day.
But that's interesting that in 2023, the peak was still
3 to 4 p.m.
3 to
Yep.
4 p.m.
It was very surprising. It could have been a cloudy day. Actually, I haven't looked at that, but that can impact the amount of solar.
Mm,
Could have been hot, muggy, and cloudy.
yeah.
Next slide. All right, the transmission peaks. These are monthly. This shows for every month of each one of these years between 2015 and 2014, the hour during which the transmission cost was assessed. And you can see there's much more variability here. You can see in certain time periods, if you look at the lowest bar in 2017, the peak hour was determined to be between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. That was in March. Whereas earlier in 2017, or sorry, in October of 2016, the peak was between 6 and 7 p.m. So the transmission peaks are much harder to predict, particularly in the shoulder months. You'll see a lot of these earlier ones, 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. do happen in April and October. Very difficult to determine when the peak is going to occur. And now it's much more consequential because the transmission cost is so much more than the capacity cost. Next slide. So one point to make is that CMLP's coincident peak, and what we mean by coincident peak is, again, not when the CMLP system is peaking itself, but what its load was during the hour that the wider grid peaked. So that coincident peak will always be less than or equal to its non-coincident peak. So in other words, the non-coincident peak is when the CMLP system peaks, regardless of what the wider grid is doing. So let's look at like 2021. The CMLP's peak was 40.945 megawatts, and yet our coincident peak was only 38.034 megawatts. And that's because the hour of the wider grid peaking was not the hour we were peaking, right? So the coincident peak always has to be less than the non-coincident peak. They can be the same. Like in 2023, you see those two figures are the same. They're both roughly 38 megawatts. That's because the hour that the grid told us they peaked was the same hour that CMLP peaked. I know that's a lot of peaks, but I hope this point is understood.
And I think Laura saying that the having a non-coincident peak, having a larger dark red bar is valuable to ratepayers.
Yes, because we're not paying our fair share, if you will. We're not paying for our maximum load. We're paying for a smaller amount. So that's very helpful. That's a good point, Brian. Next slide.
But that value is diminishing over time as transmission charges increase. The proportion of capacity associated with transmission increases.
Well, even with transmission, if the transmission hour is different than CMLP's peak, then we're paying less than our maximum.
Right.
So here's some detail. I know it's a bit boring, but I just want to point out a couple things. This is an actual example of what CMLP is expected to pay to pay the ISO for regional network service in 2025. Each megawatt of load costs $15,850 each month, or $190,000 per year. Said another way, for every kilowatt a customer can shift their peak load, CMLP will save $15.85 each month, which adds up to $190 per kilowatt per customer per year. And you can see here how solar does impact what we have to pay for transmission. You can see during the high solar months of March through September, where solar is producing much more than they do in the winter, what we have to pay for transmission is reduced by that solar contribution. But this cost is very expensive. I mean, this is $6 million in cost for CMLP per year. And if a customer who typically uses, say, 4 or 5 kilowatts in their home can shift 2 kilowatts off the peak, you're talking about, for transmission, if they could do it every single month, that's almost $380 a year savings to them. So it's a lot of money. Next slide. The capacity cost is a little bit different again, because we saw in transmission that the peak changed each month. In capacity, it only changes once a year, and the capacity year is based on a July-June year. That's why you see the change here happening in June. And what happens is CMLP, they take CMLP's peak. So for 2025, for January through May, that peak was set on September 7th, 2023. it was between 5 and 6 p.m., 38.102 megawatts. The ISO then sort of arbitrarily grosses that up by what they call a multiplier. This is supposed to be the reserve adder. I will point out, in my own personal opinion, I think this reserve adder is way too high. You know, I operated electric systems out west in the 90s, and the typical reserve margin was closer to 20 to 25%. But PJM and the New England grid both operate at very high multipliers, which is very inefficient. And they're doing this because they're trying to protect against the variability of the renewable load, the variable unit contingent load, where they just don't know if the wind's going to blow or the sun's going to shine. So that multiplier grosses up the obligation that of what we have to pay for, from 38 to 54 megawatts. And then we're paying $4,500 a month in the first few months of 2025. That generates, you know, a $240,000 monthly bill in capacity for us. Starting in June, the rate changes our peak in 2024 provisionally, because I don't have the final number yet. Looks like it's going to be 38.591 megawatts. The ICAP rate goes down because it's a market-based rate and it fluctuates with supply and demand. So our capacity cost is actually, although we're paying on a higher volume, it looks like it's going to reduce a little bit to 167,000, but still adding up to $2.4 million in cost per year. Next slide. So the point about lowering costs is we can't change the rate we are charged for capacity nor transmission. The ISO sets that rate. And although FERC supposedly reviews it, you know, and we have some input as a user, it's largely a dictated rate. So our only opportunity here is to change how much we are using during the ISO peak hours. And there are a number of ways we can do this. We can use energy storage to shift our, to charge the battery during low use hours and then discharge it during high use hours. By discharging it, we reduce our imports from the ISO and reduce the volume that we will be obligated to pay transmission and capacity for. Another big opportunity here to reduce how much we're using is time of use rates, which hopefully will encourage people to shift usage to the extent possible off of those peak periods. We can offer load control programs where CMLP helps the customer shift their load off the peak. And then to a certain extent, the in-town solar generation will contribute. It contributes less and less over time as there's more and more solar, but it does have a positive contribution in terms of reducing how much we're using during the hours that the ISO system peaks. And I believe that's my last slide.
Last slide, yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Any questions for Laura? Comments? That was very helpful.
It was.
Perfect presentation. Thank you.
And
Very
Laura, that last slide you showed is what I got excited and showed my wife. Because it is, we can't control everything, but what we can control is what we do and how much we consume. So,
Good.
and those 4 bullets are how we control that load.
Good. So I think, John, were you going to say
If I can
something?
just make one comment, the one thing that really struck me was the transmission versus capacity and the variability of when transmission cost responsibility is incurred. And that to me is one of the real challenges. And I feel like we're going to want to be as smart as we can in terms of what drives this and to what degree we can influence when customers are consuming electricity, because I'm not convinced we're going to be able to. I think we're going to be, you know, very likely kind of missing those peak periods pretty regularly. But I look forward to more analysis and greater understanding on that issue.
Before we get to public comments, let me make one comment to the board. If anybody wants to provide any feedback on the different bill forms or what you think the bill should look like, or any reactions to any of the sample bills in the packet, please send that to Jason and Laura by this time next week so that they have time to compile that and include it in materials that we'll be discussing at our next board meeting in 2 weeks. Okay? Public comments, let's start. Cameron or Colin, do either of you have any comments from the Finance Committee and Select Board? Colin.
Hi, Carlin Reed, 83 Wits End. I'm a member of the Finance Committee, but speaking on my own behalf, just a quick touch base. When do you expect the time of use rates to go into effect?
We're hoping January 2026.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see a comment from Cameron. Linda Neiman.
Hi, Linda Neiman, 59 Mallard Drive. This was a really interesting meeting. I learned a lot. I just wanted to make a couple comments. The first is about the bill, which is confusing. I want to give, I really like the Cobb EMC one. And actually, that was one of the few that actually said what the on-peak and off-peak times were, because I was looking for that as well. As a resident, all I want to know is how much is my bill, when it's off-peak and on-peak and off-peak, and what it has been historically. So I really like the 12-month format. And I think simplicity, as everyone was saying, is a good thing. And for more deep dives, it should be a QR code for folks that are really interested. One thing I don't see in any of these are folks that have solar, like another chart showing what your generation was. You know, for myself, like if I see that I'm using a lot of energy that's on peak, I would want to know when it is and then how that compares to my solar. And the other thing I wanted to add is that about shaving the peak. I do get an email. You can sign up. I know that you all do that to let people know when there's going to be a peak demand day. Do you have any information about that and how effective it is? I know it certainly affects my behavior and some of my friends. And if more of that could be implemented so folks can actually contribute and help.
Hey, thanks for those very helpful comments. Pamela Dritt.
Pamela Dritt, 13 Concord Green. I think when we make simplicity a goal, what we really mean is transparency and understandability. And I don't think we should make simplicity a goal on its own, because these systems are complex. And if we want to maximize the return for everybody, we need to do the complex things that produce that. That's why we're doing time of use rates to start with. And I agree, the Cobb bill, we want to maximize the amount of information we show in a clear and a simple way. So it's the way we show the information should be simple. The information should not. What we do shouldn't be. And I like the Cobb multicolors in the single bar allows you to see at a glance a whole lot of complex information simply and clearly and quickly. And I really like that.
Hey, thanks very much. Those are very good comments. I like your focusing on the term understandability being what we should be aiming for. So
And
thank you.
transparency. And also, we need to remember that we're trying to influence behavior because it makes it fairer to every. We won't have the fairest rates should encourage the kind of behavior that will save us all money over the long run. And that means we have to really incentivize homeowner investments in solar and battery, because those are the things that we can use to lower the peaks. And I didn't know the things about distribution costs. We need to also reward battery installers and solar installers, because they will diminish the distribution costs that we pay massively.
So thank you, Pamela. Very good. Does somebody want to make a motion to adjourn? Brian?
I move that we adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank Bianca,
Yes.
John,
Yes.
Brian,
Yes.
and I vote to adjourn as well.